Hi, Brian. I wanted to give you a little introduction here. Uh,
Sure.
Brian is the Chiefs, City Chiefs Resilience Officer and Director of the Office of Resilience and Capital Planning. Mr. Strong is responsible for the city's 10-year coastal plan, its capital budget, and the implementation of the Resilient SF strategic vision. Well, that's a lot of words you got there. Without
Yeah.
further ado,
I'm
Brian
not
Strong.
sure. Yeah. Hi, thanks for the introduction, Glenn. And I thought I was showing up right on time. But I hope you're all doing well. I know you guys had other business going on, but I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. And I see a couple familiar faces here as well. Yeah, I know, Glenn, I don't know, I think you were saying around 30 minutes or so.
Yeah, that'd be fine. Sure.
Yeah, and I mean I do have some slides that I can run through, and then I know there may be some questions that people have. I mean I'm happy also just to talk. It's however you guys would like to do this is okay with me. So, and if I do the slides, I will just I haven't, excuse me, I should be able to share with Zoom. I can try sharing my screen if that would be helpful.
Yeah, not a problem.
All right, let's do that. Okay, can everyone see that?
Not yet.
No, not yet. Okay, hold on a minute.
There we go.
Yeah,
All
there you
right.
very nice.
Okay.
Resilient in San Francisco.
Yeah, okay. So, uh as as I was being introduced, as I am the city's chief resilience officer. I actually report up to the city administrator. I've been the chief resilience officer since 2016 or so. Um and I am also oversee the city's 10-year capital plan. So I'm also the director of the Office of Resilience and Capital Planning. They used to be two sort of separate offices. They were combined in 2016, essentially, and we work on, resilience overall for the city as well as the capital plan. And I'll try to go over those two things fairly quickly and then make sure I have time for questions. Uh, Let me just make sure that this is able to go forward. Okay, so I mentioned the office. So, we really, when you think about resilience, we're thinking in terms of addressing big shocks. And I think I got some questions from Charles or so forth, around earthquakes and some of those traditional big things that we think about. Um, Earthquakes, floods, those shocks that are a real jolt to the system. But we're also looking at chronic stressors as well. And some people think about climate change as something that's sort of chronically going, fairly slowly, but it's going to have big impacts on us. But there's also social equity, infrastructure investments, all those types of things, unaffordability. And if you're not addressing those as a city, then when you have a big shock, you're in a much more difficult, much more precarious situation, right? That's when you have situations like in New Orleans where, a third of the population or so left in this left to Houston and so forth. So we're trying to look at both of those things. And today I'm going to talk about the two kind of key documents or key plans that we manage for the city. One is the Hazards and Climate Resilience Plan. It's also a local hazard mitigation plan. And the second is the 10-year capital plan. I know George Wooding there is very familiar with the 10-year capital plan, but I'm not sure how much I've talked to him about the hazards and climate plan that we've put together. So I'm going to go into that really quickly because they dovetail together somewhat nicely. I mean, the hazards and climate resilience plan is looking at hazards that are facing the city, over the long term. And we face sort of 13 different hazards that are laid out here. Everything, in these sort of broad categories: geological, like earthquakes and landslides; weather related, wind, flooding; extreme heat, something that has become a very big concern in San Francisco as of late; fire related, post earthquake fires is primarily the fire impacts that we have. There's certainly air quality issues related to it. And wildfire, the wildfire is much less of an issue for San Francisco than, compared to Oakland or even San Mateo or many of our neighbors. And then there's sort of the biologic and toxic things, which are somewhat man-made. They're not necessarily man-made, but they could be. But we've got pandemics and hazardous materials. So I'm not going to go into each of these. I'm going to focus on the two I think that are sort of most relevant to San Francisco today. And before I do that, let me just mention this plan. This is something, we put together. It's a requirement for FEMA to receive FEMA dollars. Every county is required to have this if you want to be eligible for FEMA general assistance or their hazard mitigation grant or what they're calling building resilience in communities grants program. We have put together these maps that anyone can go to and look at on our website. And these maps allow you to turn on and off different hazards. So you can see the places where you're vulnerable to earthquakes or liquefaction, which means soil that's more liable to shake. But you can also see, where we're going to see flooding, and you can see the overlap. You can see where we have hazardous waste issues, and you can see the overlap there. You can see the wildfire overlap. So it's a we think it's a really great tool, and it's in response to the public comment that we received when we put together the plan back in 2020, which is we want to understand, we want to have the same access to information as the city does. So this is there, and you can actually zoom in and look at it, by neighborhood. Within that plan, one of the big issues that we're looking at, was mentioning the two sort of issues that are really facing San Francisco. It's the climate change issues, and this sort of shows what we're doing in terms of overall climate, addressing the climate issue. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about earthquakes, and then I'll talk about our capital plan. So in terms of climate issues, this sort of shows the broader picture of what we're looking at. In the middle, we have the Hazards and Climate Resilience Plan that really talks about how are we dealing with climate changes? How are we preparing for it? How are we adapting to it? The other side of that is the climate action strategy or the climate action plan that the city has. And that's really about reducing greenhouse gases. How can we slow climate change down? So clearly we're interested in trying to do both. And that becomes a challenge that we'll face with our capital plan and with other things is how do you support the ability to reduce greenhouse gases, to increase to allow for more electrification of cars, those types of things in the city, so that we're reducing the greenhouse gases that we're facing. In terms of mitigation, or in terms of adaptation, I should say, a lot of what we're looking at, are sort of some of these bigger projects like sea level rise. I'll show you, but this map, sort of shows the old borders of San Francisco, and this sort of shows some of the vulnerabilities that we have to sea level rise. And a lot of this gets into the work that the port has been doing. We've been working with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to look at addressing the seawall, and it means addressing it from a seismic point of view, but also addressing it in terms of being able to adapt to the rising waters in the bay, where we're especially vulnerable. We're not as vulnerable on the other side, but we do have issues around erosion on the ocean beach and those types of things. So we have a group of folks, and we're working on a lot of those different projects. The other program that we're doing, and I think Charles is on this call. I know this is something that he's been tracking, which is our seismic retrofit programs. And when we think about the retrofit programs for privately owned buildings, which is part of our earthquake safety implementation plan, and it's also part of our community action for seismic safety, community action plan for seismic safety. A lot of these, I apologize, big, long words here, long acronyms. But the idea is that, after Loma Prieta especially, we identified some of the vulnerable buildings in the city, and it's a way to continue to address these one step at a time. So it was a 30-year plan. We have addressed unreinforced masonry buildings. Those were one of the first things that were addressed after Loma Prieta. Even before this plan was put together, there was an ordinance, and those are the old red brick buildings. You saw a lot of these collapse in Santa Cruz during the earthquake. We had a few of them during our earthquake in Loma Prieta, but it's much more prevalent there. It happened in Napa, also happened in Paso Robles. It happened in Christchurch fairly, more recently. So those have been addressed in San Francisco. That was around 2000, I think, 2 to 2,000 or so unreinforced masonry buildings have been addressed. Where Portland's trying to catch up to us and just doing this work, and same with Seattle. That was a big achievement. We did the soft story retrofit program. These are for 5+ unit soft story buildings. There are approximately, we're at 94% compliance. So the ordinance passed in 2013 or so, or 2011, I want to say. The first retrofits were required. This was a mandatory program in 2013, and then there was sort of, you had tiers. There were 4 or 5 tiers over 8 years. That program is at 94% compliance. That's around 5,900 buildings. It affects about 114,000 individuals that live in those buildings that are much safer, safer places to live. So that's the soft story retrofit program. We did a private schools evaluation program. That was not mandatory, but that is also was in place and is still being followed up on by DBI, where you had to verify, you had to do complete information, higher engineering, complete information to evaluate your buildings, and those are publicly available, and they're available for parents and for people who are sending their kids to schools. It's resulted in a lot of work that's being done. Facade maintenance, that's a program to looking at the facades. This was updated recently because of the heavy winds that we had, and we had some windows. We never experienced 70-mile-per-hour winds in San Francisco, but with some of the large storms we're beginning to see, that's starting to happen. So there was an update to that facade maintenance ordinance recently. The one we're focused on now, and I'll get into more details, is the concrete tilt-up program. These are buildings that were made of concrete that where the concrete is brittle. There's not enough steel rebar in the concrete, and they have a tendency either to waffle out or to move sideways and collapse. And we've seen these collapses. The first time they really noticed it in California was in Northridge, but they even saw some of it, I think, even earlier than that. But Northridge is where I think the more recent one that started some code changes. But you can see in the picture in the bottom right there, that was a very, that was in New Zealand. That was not using old, outdated codes. Those were using very good, codes for that day. And you had these buildings, you had this building collapse, and we saw it in Mexico City and other places too. So that is probably the biggest concern in terms of potential loss of life, and in terms of the next set of buildings that we want to address. And after that, we've already started to put together some programming around vulnerable steel buildings and being able to again, that will be the next set of buildings that we want to get at. There aren't as many steel buildings as there are concrete buildings. There's still some question marks around their vulnerabilities, but it's something that we've already started to do some work on through a contact with the Applied Technology Council, which brings in experts from around the area, from around the world, as a matter of fact. So I mentioned the concrete building safety program. This effect, they're around what we think, and this is a very rough estimates, around 3,500 to 4,000, what we think are potentially concrete buildings in the city. They're mostly in the northeast part of the city, in the sort of older part of town and south of Market. These buildings are hard. It's hard to tell. It's not like soft story where you can look at a building and say, oh, I see there's a story where you don't have a lot of beams. These are buildings where you would really have to almost tear apart the plaster around the beams or tear off the fire coating and other things, pull apart the concrete to be able to see how much steel is in there. So they're difficult to identify and they're costly to retrofit. But we have been working on this for a little while, for a couple years now. We had a stakeholder working group that got together and met for a little more than a year and a half. And we have legislation that was actually introduced very recently by Supervisor Melgar that is going to be considered, which will create what we're calling a voluntary retrofit program, or voluntary standards that don't really exist today in terms of being able to tell people what they should do if they have a building that they think is concrete. And also, it requires the completion of a building checklist. So in the soft story program and in our other programs, we actually started those by reaching out to people and asking them to fill out a checklist, work with an engineer and tell us is the building, so we could understand whether it was in the program or not in the program. So with this concrete program, that's what we're doing. We think that's the most important first step. And that the completion of those checklists will either lead to potentially a mandatory program down the road. It's going to also create much more awareness. And that combined with the new retrofit standards and will also allow people with information on how to get their buildings fixed. Moving on, I'll just very quickly mention, you know, we have our own city buildings that need to be retrofitted.
Shrink is here, Greg.
So we have some pictures here of
In
those
black,
buildings. Hall of Justice.
Excuse me, Brian, someone is talking and interfering with the presentation. Could you please all put on mute, please? Excuse me, Brian.
No worries. No worries. Thanks, Glenn. Yeah, I was hearing that too. I wasn't sure. All right. So anyway, we do have a number of our own city buildings that we're also trying to address. Some of them are concrete, like our homeless shelters. So we have 3 homeless shelters. They're concrete. One, you know, there are 2 pictures of them in the bottom of the slide here. There's our Human Service Agency building at 170 Van Ness. That's concrete. We actually have plans to move out of that building in the next year. We hope, or in the next 2 years. So that's the work that the city is also doing to address the vulnerabilities of our publicly owned buildings. Of course, we would also be subject to that concrete ordinance, just to be clear. I mentioned a little bit about the sea level rise and so forth. So this is this is the Ports Waterfront Resilience Program. I think, you know, we know that we have potential, you know, large flood risk. You can see these areas. This is sort of a more zoomed in view of that map I was mentioning before, with significant flood risk by 2050 and by 2100. We're already seeing a lot of flooding in the areas you can see in the picture up here. You know, that's right just south of the ferry building, and it's close to the Muni Bar entrance on, I think that's on Mission and Harrison over in that area. Yeah, Harrison. And then there's a whole draft plan that we're working with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers on, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Shoreline infrastructure. So I just want to emphasize, you know, Treasure Island is moving forward. They have a really good adaptation plan that they've put together. They're also doing a lot of soil remediation work to address to address earthquakes. Ocean Beach, we know, is there's a climate adaptation plan. This was not part of the, you know, highway or any of those things. This is something that was put together some time ago, and it's really to address erosion issues along the beach and to try to restore some of the natural dunes and so forth to help protect it, because we are seeing the beach in certain areas, you know, really shrink. And then you see in the up right here, we're also required now to develop a shoreline adaptation plan. So that's something that's going to start to come up very soon. We have a grant that we received from the Bay Conservation and Development Commission through the state to start to do that work. Glenn, I see you have your hand up. Is there something you wanted to jump in?
Oh, you know, no, it's just when you begin to ask questions, I have a question, you know, eventually for you. So
All right, you got
continue
it.
on with your
I'm gonna go on. I'm
presentation.
gonna try to go really quickly because I realize this. You know, I want to make sure we have some time for questions. Stormwater flood resilience. So the PUC's been working on this plan to address floods within the city in some of these really persistent areas like around Cayuga, 17th and Folsom. That's a program that they've already required that when you own property in those areas, you have to notify you know, when you sell it, you have to notify people. But there are plans to do considerably more in terms of flood proofing or providing resources for people to do flood proofing. Heat and air quality, I mentioned it there before. You can see this map that we've developed. We've developed this heat and air quality resilience plan. We know the areas on the east side are most vulnerable, but you can see there are some areas on the west side too. And with sea level rise and with the loss of fog and with the inability of, you know, where it doesn't get cool at night, we're seeing that becoming more and more of an issue. And then I'll just mention the 10-year capital plan is what we use to sort of address not just hazards, but ongoing infrastructure needs in the city. This is a big part of how we fund things. We put this plan out every 2 years. The idea is for it to be objective, and then we let the board, the board hopefully fight it out and have these discussions while the plan's in place, so that when we move forward with a bond or with doing the work, that we don't have a lot of arguments and a lot of discussion. We end up spending a lot of time rather than us actually getting to do the work. And we know with capital projects, if you don't do the work, time is what costs you the most money, the escalation that happens if you're sitting and waiting. So we try to get the decisions done, and this is the only place where we have all of the city's capital needs located in one area. And the big part of this program that most people follow is the GO bonds. Of course, these are the ones that go on the ballot. This sort of shows the picture going back to 1998 in terms of what's been passed and what hasn't been passed. You can see actually that, we had a few bonds pass around in the late 90s, but then we had a period of time. And actually, if you look back even further, we were at about 55% passage rate of GO bonds. Since we've done the capital plan, we've tried to lay these things out and have a more rational program. We've been much more successful. 90%. The only one that failed was a small nonprofit housing developer one to sort of help nonprofit housing developers do retrofits. And then the other one was the MTA bond that failed by a few percentage points recently. All right, I'm just going to quickly show, we're facing some hurdles right now in terms of budgets. I just want to emphasize that the capital plan and the investments that we've made in the city, $6.5 billion, have made a difference in terms of our ability to have good facilities, even in light of the recession that we're running into right now and some of the budget challenges. I mean, we've got significant investments in parks, significant investments in fire facilities, public health facilities, including a new hospital and several new health clinics around the city. Key facilities that some of it came out of the Hall of Justice, like the medical examiner facility and the public safety building, but also, which is part of the police facilities over here. But also, large infrastructure, important infrastructure that we've been maintaining. So this is the overall capital plan. Just to let you know, it's $52 billion. $7 billion is in the general fund area. That's what we tend to focus most of our effort on. $27 billion is going to be our enterprise departments. A lot of that's the airport and the PUC, where they're making big investments. And then I'm just going to try to wrap up here, but capital, just to let you know, the opportunity, the challenges that we're facing around sea level rise, housing, and those types of things are sort of represented on this left side. This again is mostly general fund department area, but you can see 27 billion for affordable housing, climate resilience. A lot of that's that seawall bond and the match that we're going to need to do. But there are other issues there too. That includes the match, but it also includes improvements at Muni and so forth. Around climate resilience, it's around $13 billion. Seismic strengthening, $2.8 billion. That's just the city buildings. Renewal programs. While we've been doing a lot of geobond work, we've been falling behind on taking care of what we own, and we have backlog renewals and throughout the city, and this is for streets and infrastructure. So that's in the $2 billion range as well. So with that, I will take questions on anything that you guys have, and I appreciate your time and letting me run through all that different stuff. So go ahead, Glenn.
Yeah, that was a great
Yeah.
presentation. Thank you so much. The first question I'd like to ask, I don't know if you've been to London and saw the Thames structure that stops water from flowing into the city of London and flooding it. It turns out that just 8 feet of sea level rise is going to cause an inland sea in the Central Valley. And so I'm wondering if it's possible for us to consider some sort of a water barrier similar to the Thames barrier in London in the United Kingdom. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I know I've not gone to see it, but I know several people have, and I know it's something that they're definitely looking at. Some of the improvements that are being sought around the Mission Bay area especially, and then and a little bit less so, but down in Isleas Creek, are looking at those types of solutions or are developing some of those barriers. The tricky part that we have, and certainly London and as well, is, you know, when you build these barriers, it keeps water out, but at the same time, we're seeing these larger storms that are bringing wetter, more extreme precipitation. So we're keeping the bay water out, but then at the same time, you got to be able to let the rainwater, you know, the other precipitation get out too. So that's the challenge. And if you can't let it out, you need places to store it before you can move it through the system to be able to let it drain out.
Right.
And we don't, you know, parts of San Francisco are already a basin, but that is part of the challenge. On top of it, Glenn, you're also starting to see some issues around the water levels rising. So with sea level rise, you're also starting to see the water table below begin to rise. And, you know, there
Right.
are a number of our buildings like the Moscone Center where they're actually Moscone Center, the new Moscone Center, if a lot of the water for toilets and those types of things are water that they're collecting underground and pumping because they already have some aquifers in there that they need to constantly sort of pump that water so that they're not getting oversaturated.
Wow.
So
Would you be
big
kind enough
challenge.
to lower
Yeah.
your presentation so we can see the hands that are being raised?
Yeah, I'm happy to bring it back up if you want, but or if anyone has questions about a particular slide. But I know Dave had his hand up.
Yeah, hi, Brian, thanks for joining
Yeah.
us. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the status of the concrete building legislation? I know that
Yeah.
Mayor Breed mandated that, nice picture,
Yeah.
that legislation be introduced by last October.
There we go. I can stop sharing now.
And
Yeah, sorry.
it was my understanding that that was more for what's called non-ductile buildings, which I think is older, like old theaters,
Oh no.
concrete
Yeah.
walls where there's no steel in the wall at all. But you were
Yeah.
showing pictures of newer
Yep.
concrete buildings which have steel
Yep.
in them.
Yep. It's
So
not that they
what,
don't have steel in them. They just don't have enough steel. So it's not these older buildings. In fact, the most vulnerable. So when we have this concrete program and we're talking about what we think, you know, the universe looks like it's around, I said around 3,700 or so buildings, but we expect a lot of those buildings to fall off when we get more information on them. So it's probably going to be, we're thinking around 2,500 or so buildings to 3,000, 3,000, I think at the most, in terms of non-ductile, what we call non-ductile concrete, but it's not non-ductile, it's low ductile. It's just that
I
there is
see.
not enough in there to withstand the forces of an earthquake, of a significant earthquake. So it will address buildings up to the 1990s. In fact, it's going to go buildings that were so fairly recent. And we saw actually in Mexico City, some of these buildings that were recently constructed with similar codes have, you know, struggled. So most of the buildings that are vulnerable are in the late 1940s or 50s to the 1970s or so, when we were doing these big concrete buildings with lots of overhangs and that were very, very heavy. So these sort of heavy concrete buildings are especially vulnerable. Those are the ones we're most worried about, more so than the ones built in the 1920s or 1930s, where they were much more box-like construction and they had thicker walls. So those are the buildings we're more concerned about. 2/3 of the buildings that we're looking at are commercial. The other and a third are residential. So not as many residential, I mean, not as many commercial, which is good because residential tend to have occupants in them, you know, for longer periods of the day. But those are the buildings we're looking at. Yes, Supervisor Breed had an executive directive, and really what Mayor Breed had an executive directive. What Supervisor Melgar now is following up on, and well, she's introduced it, is how can we take those sort of recommendations, that executive directive, and move them forward?
So you're
Answer your question?
including
Yeah.
22-story concrete buildings to be analyzed. I mean,
Yeah, I don't know how many are that tall. I don't have the data right in front of me. There aren't very many, like when we did the tall building study, there were not many there may be only one or two concrete buildings that were that tall. So yeah, they would need to be evaluated, but I think the more concern are probably 4 to 8 or 9-story buildings. Those are the bigger concerns.
All right. Thank you very much for that answer.
Yeah.
Barbara Hefferman.
Hi, Brian. I want to revisit your Islas Creek adaptation strategy and get a sense of that. I actually rent a art studio at the corner of Rankin and Custer.
Uh-huh.
That whole area is a floodplain. The
Yeah.
sewer system there doesn't drain enough water, and unfortunately, in the last couple of years, we've had torrential rains and we've had our building flooded twice.
Right.
Is
Right.
this part of that they're looking at? I mean, it's not just
yeah.
the creek itself, but the actual, that whole corridor is a flood zone.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it is absolutely something we're looking at, and I know the PUC's been looking at it too. There are some issues that they had with the state water board as well in terms of water releases into the bay. So it's an area of concern. Within the flood study with the Army Corps of Engineers, I think it's a combination of doing some flood walls with some more natural, berms and some of those things, and trying to take advantage of all the city-owned property there.
Yeah, because I mean, when you think of that area, it's ripe for development. It's very industrial now.
Right.
But it's on the bay, but it's not only the water in Islas Creek that could flood, it's the rainwater that's flooding because of inadequate drainage.
Right. Yeah, and that's right where all the water comes through, right? I mean, that's
Yeah.
a huge watershed area.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, it's an area that's being addressed. There was an Islas Creek mobility study that we also did, that the city did. I'm happy to share it with you. You can look it up. It was done by the planning department and the MTA and the port sort of combined, sort of within that Climate SF program. And I was trying to address some of the flooding and thinking about it from a transportation perspective.
To get that information, would I go onto your website under
I don't, you may be able to find it on my website at
or
on our
where
website.
would I look?
I would look under planning's website.
Okay.
And Islas Creek, it's like Islas Creek Mobility Plan.
Okay, I'll look it up.
I can try to find it, and I can send it to Charles if you want, and then he can
Yes,
share it
that
with
would
you.
be great. And then I can connect with Charles. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
All right, Mari.
Hi, you answered most of my questions, particularly about the height of the buildings. If it's a tilt up, it seems like it couldn't be terribly high.
That's right.
But the weight of the concrete is something that too many people didn't really take into account. So my question, I guess, for you has more to do with the water rise below the land that's coming up in some of the creeks like Mission Creek and that sort of thing. So the other thing is there's some concern. My building was built in 1925 and it's concrete, reinforced concrete. We're kind of wondering about the steel and whether or not the steel is at all in kind of danger of being encroached on by the rising waters, because I know at least in Florida, that's been an issue, that they've had some problems with their foundation.
Yeah.
So is that a condition in San Francisco, or is it just because it's saltwater there that they're concerned about?
Yeah, I mean, it's not as much so, after what happened in Florida, there were a lot of discussions in the city, and we had discussions with various engineers and so forth, and thinking about whether we should have some of their programs, where they require this sort of regular review of all the city buildings. One advantage that we have in San Francisco, and even I think going back to the age even of your building, is that because of the earthquakes, the amount of steel and concrete that we use has been considerably more than in Florida and some of those places. So that adds a layer of protection, or that makes us feel a little bit more secure that we're not going to have these where you essentially, I mean, there were construction flaws in that, but then also ignoring sort of so they had construction flaws, they had way too much weight on the building, and then they had this water seepage um, that created, a terrible condition. So it isn't to say that we don't have those issues in San Francisco, especially if you go, it's more on the west side of the city where you have the salt and water intrusions.
The west side.
The west side, yep. Yeah, on the
Wow.
west side, less
Oh,
so on the
okay.
east side. Um, we just can't comment. I couldn't comment on specific buildings. The rising water is more, again, that's closer to the bay area, but there could be some areas near your building too. So it may be worth, looking into.
Well, I
Yeah.
guess what I could do is email you or something, my questions about a specific situation. But I can send some, I found a really, really good geological book that goes through a lot of different details about what's going on in San Francisco.
All right.
So that
Thank
was
you.
very helpful, but I can share that with you later.
Yeah, no, feel free, and I can send you a link to that groundwater study.
Okay, I'd like to
done.
see what you have
Yeah.
and compare it to what this other book is.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All
Good
right.
question,
Keep them
Lauren.
coming, Glenn. All right.
Yeah, here we go. Okay, so
Yeah.
I want to forgive me. I'm going to hit you with 3 questions. There are 43 high rises with mat foundations. Mat
Yeah.
foundations are why the Millennium Tower failed. That's one question. What are we going to do about it? There are
Mm-hmm.
25 buildings on high liquefaction locations. And lastly, there are 39 buildings with weak welded frames. I think that's the most important issue for our group here.
Yeah, I figured I thought that was gonna be David's question, but totally fine. So in terms of the MAT Foundation, so we did this tall building study, and a lot of it came about because of Millennium, but it also came about because of the dramatic shift in downtown from pure office to residential and office together, right? This sort of mixed use buildings that we have. When we've spoken with the experts, and again, we worked with the Applied Technology Council that brought in people from around the world. And what they found was that just because you have a MAT foundation doesn't mean that your building is necessarily more vulnerable. And even when you go, and it doesn't, and I think the finding was that going, for every building to go all the way down to bedrock, and there's even different definitions of bedrock, of what it would be or what it wouldn't be, isn't necessarily going to provide that much more safety. So the idea of mat or a slab foundation, which like our Moscone Center is on a slab foundation, my house is on a slab foundation. um, is that, and I do think they have found this. Again, I'm not an engineer, so I don't want to represent engineering studies or anything, but they found that those buildings do perform, well in earthquakes, even when they're on, in areas that have liquefaction. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone is going to do well, and certainly there are issues with Millennium um, that are beyond my knowledge to really comment on and so forth. But we haven't seen that, we haven't seen that with other buildings. And, there was discussion about whether or not you should require every building to have to go down to a certain level. And I think the experts came back and said, yeah, we don't, that at least in the tall buildings report, they didn't seem to, there wasn't a definitive like, no, absolutely the city should be doing that. It was no, we should be looking at these buildings and we have a performance-based a tool. It's a tool and a process where you do a peer review, where you do it sort of based on how an actual building is going to perform. So you provide the actual design, and then you do modeling. And you have to share that modeling with a peer, a group of peers um, that that are selected by that are paid for by the developer, but selected by the city. We actually improved that process quite a bit to make sure that the geotechnical perspectives were considered, that they weren't sort of pushed down by engineers or by developers or so forth, that those were actually also that they were sort of taking they were getting their due. Um, and that is now in place, and that sort of happened after, that was as a result of this tall buildings report. In terms of the 39 buildings, so that's the steel. You talk about weak welded frames. That's the steel moment frame buildings. That was another one where, so right now we're working with Applied Technology Council. There are two tasks associated with that. One is to look at whether it's to really look at whether there were damage after Loma Prieta, and they have done a survey. It's not published yet, but they've done a survey with different firms to see if anyone has found damage from some of those buildings. I think they looked at 15 of them or something, and so far they haven't found anything, but it's still preliminary. There's something else I was going to say about those. And then the other thing that we're working on is after an earthquake, you have what's kind of you have post-earthquake evaluations is what they call it. And after an earthquake, if you see unexpected damage, then we can require that it be fixed. And it could be in a small earthquake, a big earthquake, either one. And what we are doing right now is developing the guidelines, the administrative bulletins and the guidelines. So after, if we do see, like, we had a 4.0 earthquake the other day, if there is some unexpected damage in one of these buildings, there was a steel weld frame building, then we could require them to sort of go through this process where they could actually determine if the damage is serious enough, then we would require that that DBI would require that they fix it. And this would be the tool, like how they could do that. So that post-earthquake evaluation program, we're also updating that for the concrete buildings too. It's important. So those are the two major steps there. I think probably by October or November, David, is when we should be seeing those results, and when we'll be trying to present some of them around it. I would just say, and I know the New York Times, there's some different articles on it. There's still some questions about how serious the steel moment frame issue is. We know it can be really serious in a very extreme earthquake, but there is also a sense from some of the experts, again, I'm not one of them, but Ron Hamburger and some other folks that have been experts in the field, that you may be, there are a lot of, if you have a very extreme earthquake, there are going to be a lot of issues in the buildings. There's a lot of non-structural issues that are probably potentially going to be more damaging than the steel moment frame issues. So,
Well, Ron Hamburger
yeah,
was quoted as saying, he used to say, "Oh no, they're all okay, they're well designed," and he doesn't say that
no,
anymore.
he doesn't. That's
He
true.
says that
Yeah.
in a big 06 type earthquake, large buildings are going to fall down. And
Yeah.
I'm not hearing a lot of time frames from you as
Yeah.
as looking at this. It's all 2025 or later.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's
These
going to be,
problems have been known about for 30 years.
well, some of them, and the codes have been updated, but it takes a lot of time. And I agree with you, David. I mean, I would love to see the stuff get done tomorrow or as soon as possible. We know that, and some of this is going to result, some of this is, we know people who are doing mortgages or those things, bankers are going to be starting to look at this stuff as well. It's the tricky part, I think, is that they're expensive. I mean, the soft story program was probably not as expensive, but was still a real, took a lot of effort to get that through. But now we're talking about hundreds of dollars per square foot, having to potentially relocate people. In fact, people having to exit the building and having to temporarily relocate them and bring them back. So again, I think that has to be weighed against the risks. And I hear what you're saying, but I think the idea is that at least our approach that we've tried to take and that is that move as quickly as we can, but also ensure that people understand it, that people have time to put together the financing for it, and that they can make that they can actually get it done. They can actually do the work. So
When is the last time a large building was actually retrofitted?
oh, they're happening.
Well, not according to your database.
Well, no, I think Mariner Square did one fairly recently. UCSF did did a concrete building not too long ago. They retrofitted, and you see it at a lot of the UCs. You'd also see it at UC Berkeley, where they've done retrofits to their concrete buildings, primarily dorms and those types of things. When you're talking about for the city itself has done some, but you're shaking your head, but I'm not sure which you're talking about. And again, these large buildings where I think it's not even clear to some of the building owners that they do have a concrete building or not. So,
Well, the city does take care of their own. They
well,
did
we're trying.
retrofitted City Hall and the ferry
Yeah.
building, but when it comes to these 39 buildings with the weak weld, it seems to be, well, it's expensive. These building owners know every 10, 20, 30 years, they're going to get hit with a huge expense, and they build that into their planning. They're not surprised
Yeah,
that they have to retrofit every 20 or 30 years. But
right.
they're not now it's like 40 and 50, and they haven't been required to do it.
Yeah.
I think it's time for Frank to have his question asked, and then we can come back to you, Dave, if you still have some more questions. Frank.
Yeah, thank you. Brian, could you tell us a little bit about what's happening with the AWSS system?
Yeah.
As all of you probably know, 2/3 of the city has a great water supply system for fires and et cetera. And everything west of 19th Avenue and a good portion of the southern part of the city extending into the Excelsior, et cetera, does not. And so what temporary measures do we have in terms of pump engines and other vehicles? And when are we going to get the infrastructure improvements made?
Yeah. When I was talking about some of that seismic work on some of that slide, a big portion of this is doing the earthquake, AWSS, or what they call it now, the Emergency Firefighting Water Supply System. More, getting it out to the west side. Now, a couple of things I will say. One is that, yeah, we have a strong network in the northeast and now south of Market, and in some of the new areas where there was development, and where part of the development agreement for that was to insert AWSS pipe, so they had to put it in. And that's also required, I think, for Park Merced development and some of those other ones that are coming up. It was really through this capital plan and the Geo Bond program that we secured money to sort of address first the sort of what you call the heart of the system. So doing retrofit work at Twin Peaks Reservoir that serves the entire system, doing retrofit and improvements at the different pump stations. They just finished pump station 2, I think, recently. At the tanks, we have a couple of different tanks, and they're also doing work on manifolds. So there's a lot of work just to make sure that the system was functional, because quite honestly, it hadn't been hadn't really been tested, and even in Loma Prieta, you know, they didn't end up using it. They really used the fireboat. And that's because they had some big breaks in downtown, and the city got nervous and said, we've got these big breaks. Maybe there are other breaks, and they decided not to use the system. In terms of the west side, so as you know, there's been a lot of work, and this is not perfect. It's not the same as AWSS, but we did put in a lot of cisterns, and a lot of cisterns have been added, which again, maybe not the same thing as an AWSS system, but still important and still helpful to putting out fires. No one would say that they don't want a cistern. The other thing is that now the PUC is working, you know, on trying to take advantage of the the improvements that were made after the water system improvement program that the PUC put in. So the idea is to use those hardened lines that are going to withstand an earthquake. They're made to withstand an earthquake, and to be able to use some of those lines to deliver water, especially on the west side, because that's where some of the main lines go. And then they have branches that come off of them. They're also adding a new pump station at Merced, um, at Lake Merced, and somewhere else as well. I can't recall, and maybe, you know. So work is happening there. It is extremely expensive, and the PUC, you know, I think in the last bond, they were probably a little overly ambitious in terms of how much they thought they could fund. And then when they actually started to do the work and got in and started digging up things up, it's ended up being more expensive than they thought it was. The objective is still to have a loop and to cover, you know, as much of the west side as possible. You know, I think the fire department is confident in the work that's going on. It's still going to take time, and you know, it comes down to resources, unfortunately, and where are we going to put, you know, our resources. I do think, you know, and I think the fire department can comment on this. I mean, I do think we're in much better shape now than we were 10 years ago, for sure. And I think the plan that we have right now is to continue to steadily make improvements. You know, again, if there is a way we could identify, you know, a couple $1 billion, in light of all the other cities' needs that we could use for this, then I think you know, we'd be in favor of that. But I think it's just a matter of balancing all the other needs across the city with this one. But the level of investment, I would just say, in the system is the highest it's ever been, especially over the past 10, 15 years. So
All right,
I'll
that's a
leave it at
good
that.
answer for that question. Dave, one more question for you.
Brian, so are any of these buildings that are being discussed, being converted from office to residential that are presumably empty? So retrofitting them should be, you know, now's the time.
Now is the time.
Are any of them going to be actually retrofitted?
I hope so. I mean, we've talked to there are some that I know they are planning to do it. I know the Emerald Fund is doing a couple buildings, and they really wanted to see our concrete ordinance and what we're recommending. I should say one of the things that the experts sort of put together for us in that ordinance is a way to sort of do the retrofit without having to move people out of the upper floors of a building. So to try to encourage some of the residential work to happen. So some of these developers, I think, are really interested in that option. I mean, it's a great time to do it because the buildings are somewhat empty or more empty, but it's a bad time in terms of interest rates and in terms of, you know, the economy and all those other things. So, you know, and these building owners or developers are saying, hey, we're getting hit with all these other requirements, right, as well. Everything, you know, from ADA to you know, going all electric. I mean, there are a lot of these different things that are making challenges that are going to be challenging for some of them. So we'd like to see it happen, Dave. I mean, I can tell you there was some discussion of So right now, if you touch more than 2/3 of your building, you're required to upgrade it. You're required to do a retrofit. You may be familiar with that rule. It's sort of our 2/3 rule. That requirement is something that there was some discussion about with the previous administration around dropping it. And because this is just too important, is just they should just be able to get in. We pushed back, and that has not been changed. So now it is still the case. If you're going to touch 2/3 of your building, and I'm thinking in most of these situations that is going to be the case, then you're going to have to do the retrofit, and this is the time to do it.
Very
So,
good. Mari?
Yes, I had a really quick question. Do you get involved in fixing or dealing with the communication systems for the emergency at all? Because we understand that doesn't work.
Yeah, well, no, not really, Mari. I mean, I know there's talking about the siren system and whether the siren system, which previously worked, but then it was able to be hacked, so that it's not working right now. That is not so much capital; it's more software related. And I do think there is a lot of discussion around, what's the best way to notify people when you have a disaster now, right? And there's a lot of new technology out there. And is it best to use your phones? Is it best to use the sirens? There was talk about this in Maui, of course, because there were concerns that their sirens were working, but they didn't want to use them because the sirens told people to go to high land. That's what they were meant to do. It was to warn people of tsunamis. It wasn't meant to warn people of fires, and they didn't want to send people to high land because that's where the danger was. There's also talk about using drones now, where you have drones that can inform. So there's a lot of discussion on what the best way is to notify people. And I think the new mayor is actually very interested in this, especially after the fires down in LA, where they had some challenges with their communications.
Well, interesting question and answer. And it's getting close to 8 o'clock.
Yeah, I know.
We
Okay.
have
We're going on.
we have one more question from our esteemed member.
I was
George
hoping
Wood.
George was going to get in there with yeah.
Hi, Brian. I didn't, I didn't want to say too much. I just wanted to mention on the EWSS,
Yeah.
those high pressure pipes are called Kubota pipes,
Right.
and they originally came from Japan, and they're meant to flex in case of an earthquake rather than
That's right.
break.
Right.
My own personal feeling on EWSS is that the cistern process will not do nearly as good a job as the Kubota piping, but it's still better than nothing.
Right.
And the fire department is going to be having to buy several tender hook trucks
Right.
so that
Right.
they can work together in tandem and fight fires throughout, geometric patterns. So that was not what I really wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about, as you know, concrete
Yeah.
is the highest increase of CO2. And so whenever you have buildings collapsing, cars are really, I always get mad when I read the Department of Environment. If you dig, they always add cars to trucks.
Yeah.
And they show that that's 40% of the CO2. But if you go deeper, it's only 9% and it's decreasing rapidly. Something
Yeah.
to think about when
Yeah.
you're in your discussions. Um, so, uh, what I did want to bring up is
Oh no.
CEQA.
Just this is the last question, and this is your third question. Just so you know.
Okay, where does CEQA fit in all this? CEQA seems to be disappearing
Yeah.
rapidly.
Yeah.
You're having reports replace CEQA.
I mean,
So-
again, this is mostly being done at the state, right? CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act, for folks who may not know what the acronym stands for. I mean, those changes are coming at the state level, right? And most of them are around housing, and most of them are around trying to make it easier for people to build housing more quickly, more multifamily housing, and build it more quickly. It's still required for our other capital projects. Still required for, we're talking, any park, those types of things that are happening. We're not able to consider sea level rise in CEQA. I would like to see that changed at some point. Which is, I think, is unfortunate. I mean, even whether we have CEQA and that tool, or whether we have to develop other tools, I mean, there needs to be, it's part of what we're trying to do with this hazard mitigation plan. And we have this sort of building our future chapter of our capital plan, is to get people to collaborate earlier and understand the implications of these projects earlier. I mean, that's really what it's about. And, trying to catch all the unintended consequences.
Good answer.
So,
I
yeah.
want to thank you so very much for spending so much time with us. It's
Sure.
it's past 8 o'clock. You
Yeah.
were very generous with your time, and we would really thank you for it.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me. And thanks again for you guys. I mean, I appreciate that you guys are continuing to do this work and hold us accountable. So anyway, it's really good work. So
Thank you, Brian.
thanks for having me.
Yes,
Thank you,
thank you so
Brian.
much.